All right, folks, welcome to part two of episode 21 of What in the History. I'm Dan Brady.
I'm Johnny Smith, and before we get started, I want to shout out an old neighbor of mine. I was about 14. He was named Mr. Eddie, and he used to open down the block and like pick up trash on the neighborhood. And when you would talk to him, he was real old fashioned. And I just remember specifically, he blamed most of the state of the world on FDR.
Yeah. Huh. Well,
Yeah, still to
FDR.
this day, it was like 2004 or something. He was still blaming FDR.
Huh. Well, we're going to get into the programs and we're going to talk about some of the lasting effects and stuff like that. But, in some retrospects, your old neighbor Eddie wasn't wrong. Uh, you know. But anyway, so what do you think of part one?
I thought it was very interesting, laid the groundwork to the fall of what's about to happen, to the presidency of why FDR elected. I thought it was a very interesting filled episode. And I also want to say that at least half the episode is pro Michael Clark Duncan.
Half the podcast is pro. Oh, man. So basically, part two, we're going to talk about the New Deal. We're going to talk about the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. And if you didn't know, he served 4 terms. So we're just going to talk about his re-election, stuff like that. And then we're going to discuss whether or not he did some of these programs just to get reelected. So, today's going to be, again, another information-filled part. We're going to try to make it as exciting as possible. But, and away we go. So on March 4th, FDR was inaugurated. Now, in the nation, there was this hopeful feeling. And one of the biggest parts of FDR is he is very appealing to the American people. He was excellent at speeches. We remember a lot of the quotes from his speeches, like today is the day, December 7th will always be known as the day of infamy, stuff like that. But his inauguration speech was a speech that was needed, and it was probably one of the most well-known quotes.
So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days.
So, with that rallying cry, Washington for 3 months became a flurry of action for the first time in 4 years. FDR restored hope in America, and just and with the New Deal, the first task was to get the country back on secure financial footing. Also, good job on that, Johnny. It felt like we were interviewing FDR. To achieve this, Roosevelt proposed a bank holiday through the Bank Holiday Emergency Funding Act. Remember, 4,000 banks were closed. So basically, they closed these banks for 4 days and were analyzed by the government. Those that could be saved were given funding to help them recover. Those who couldn't were shut down. The end result was healthier financial structure that hopefully people would trust again. To further build that trust, Roosevelt administration created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. The purpose of the FDIC was to protect the money of bank customers regardless of the condition of the bank. If a bank failed and was insured, the FDIC was authorized to pay up to $2,500 to each depositor.
Now, at this point today, what's it up to? 250,000 per each depositor or per each account?
Yes, 250,000 for each depositor. Other aspects of the economy needed assistance as well. The stock market was the target of the Federal Security Act. This contained two important provisions. The first was that it enforced limits on the amount of stocks that could be bought on margin. Second, the most long-lasting, was the creation of the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC. This was intended to be a watchdog over the financial sector, preventing unfair and dangerous trading practices. Though its effectiveness has waxed and waned over the decades, it still provides a measure of security regarding the stock market that did not exist before 1933. The National Industry Recovery Act promoted cooperation between competitors and various industries to adjust prices and create wage stability for workers. The two main aspects of the act were the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, and the Public Work Administration's, the PWA. The mission of the NRA...
Now that sounds like a very pro-union things to enact.
Yeah, and, the NRA was to promote this ideology that they were pro-Second Amendment, but would continuously just take Americans' money and allow the presidents to tromp all over the Second Amendment. Wait a minute, that's not right. That's not the NRA we're talking about. Sorry, I had to get on my soapbox.
No. I like it. Give them a little bit more, Dan. Tell them what pieces of shit they are. Fuck you, Charlton Heston.
The NRA, the National Rifle Association, which is not the NRA we're talking about, is garbage. I will never give them money. I am pro-Second Amendment. I believe Americans should be driving to work in fully functional and armored tanks. But the NRA does nothing but take Americans' money, tell everybody that they're pro-Second Amendment, and they create this fear that, the Democrats are going to take away our rights. In 8 years of the Obama administration, he did nothing to impede on our Second Amendment. Yet membership increases went through the roof. But when Donald Trump took the presidency, they just basically, yes, Daddy, you want to take away bond stocks? Yes, Daddy, red flag laws are good. So let's let me get off my soapbox here. So the National Industry Recovery Act, or the NRA we were talking about, created over 700...
I feel like we could have done a whole episode. I feel like we could have done a whole episode on you just shitting on the NRA.
Johnny, don't give away our future lineup. The NRA created over 700 new codes that businesses had to follow. It also established rules promoting fair labor practices. The legislation made it legal for workers to join a union if they chose. It outlawed yellow dog contracts. These were contracts between worker and employer pledging that the worker would not join a union. If they did, the employee was terminated. So the NRA was very pro-union. Along with protecting workers' rights to join unions free of harassment, later legislation in the New Deal, but still in the first term of Roosevelt's presidency, was the creation of the National Labor Relations Act. Most significantly, the NLRA created the National Labor Review Board. This agency, still in existence today, promotes fair labor practices throughout the United States economy and provides a body to voice grievances to and act as an arbiter between employees and workers. The original 1935... Dan, go ahead.
You pro-union or anti-union?
Pro.
You ever been part of the union?
I haven't.
I have been part of the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers Union, Local 23. That was when I worked at Giant Eagle. And I look at it like if you want to be in a union and you're good with that, that's fine. But I'm not looking for a union type situation myself.
So prior to 1935, the right to collectively bargain was not guaranteed and often actively fought against by the American employers. Collectively bargain is being able to negotiate your wages and benefits. Before 1935, that was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And rural,
you know, they still tell you at jobs not to discuss your wages with your counterparts, and I think that's bullshit. Because what the fuck? We need to know who's making what for what reason. Oh, you have this skill, that's cool. Oh, you're doing the same thing as me and you're making way more money. Why is this? Like, that's just companies being fucking shady.
Right. Rural and agricultural America was also touched by the New Deal. Not in a no-no spot, but in a good way. In the first 100 days, 3 programs were enacted to aid the rural heartland of the country. Because remember, they're suffering heavily too. The Agriculture Adjustment Act provided funding to farmers who reduced production on their farms. This way, the surpluses that plagued the 1920s were vastly reduced. Unfortunately, the Agricultural Adjustment Act hurt some of the poor citizens who were hit the hardest by the Depression. Sharecroppers in the South and the internet farmers in the Midwest were put out of work. If the land wasn't being worked, there was no incentive to keep the workers. Though it did not help displace farm workers, the Civilian Conservation Corps, created in 1933, provided work to many. Providing work to men and women on a variety of projects was the key component to many of the programs engineered by the New Deal. Roosevelt was conscious of the attitude and went to great lengths to emphasize that his plan was about creating and sustaining jobs for the Americans, not giving handouts. Because remember, there's still this negative belief behind giving handouts to people who aren't working.
I mean, I get it, you know, but at the same time, you got to help people.
And now this third program had a large impact on rural Americans. It's called the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was a government-controlled corporation. It's still in operation today. It was created to modernize and make the Tennessee Valley more livable for its residents. It brought electricity, flood control, navigation, and other improvements to portions of 7 states, predominantly in the South. In order to bring these improvements, many more workers were needed, another immediate benefit of the TVA.
This is the Tennessee Valley Company?
Yeah, it's a government-run corporation, but it's the Tennessee Valley Act, yes.
The Tennessee Valley Act sounds like a band for Florida Georgia Line.
They built roadways, plumbing, you know, they just improved some of the more rural aspects of America. And then we have the Federal Emergency Relief Act, and that was passed by Congress in the first month of Roosevelt's presidency. It provided $500 million, which is equivalent to $9.4 billion today, to be distributed to state and local agencies with the stipulation that the money went to poor relief.
Dan, I want to mention that we keep talking about how rural America was. For anybody listening, in context, the national highway system didn't come along until the 50s, I believe.
This right now we're going to see the start of it, because a lot of these programs are going to build highways and stuff like that. It's just really the idea was to give Americans jobs.
Yeah, just for context though, like how different the world, the country was, 90 years ago.
Right, exactly. So the Roosevelt administration, along with the Democratic Congress, spent great amounts of money, placing the country in a financial deficit. Popularized by John Maynard Keynes, deficit spending became a governmental norm that is still employed today. But a lot of this was made easier by the personal touch that was associated with FDR himself. With a cigarette holder and partition background, it may seem odd that the majority of Americans gravitated to Roosevelt, but the key to his popularity was the embrace of his newest mass media. On the 8th day of his presidency, he started these things called fireside chats. Fireside chats were important because it was his opportunity to speak directly to Americans through the radio. We actually we have audio of the very first fireside chat. So,
you people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
So he was urging the American people to, like, yeah, this sucks, but we have to work together. It's your problem as much as it is mine. These programs can't work unless you support them. So he would regularly, throughout his presidency, speak to the American people in this tone of like loving and passion, and he identified with the American people, and that really made a lot of these new programs much easier to incorporate. Because if you have the trust of the American people, then you can really do anything.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and of course, in each of these fireside chats, he would talk to the people and tell them, what is going on, and go into in depth, and not just be like, here's another act I signed in, fucking deal with it.
Yeah, it was more personal than like the State of Address or the State of the Union. It was like a relative speaking to you. Like they had more reverence for him as a person than we do as politicians now.
Right. So
it was important to him speak. It was live. It wasn't like today where you could check it out on YouTube or a clip later. People gathered around to hear him speak.
So as his first term continued, much to the chagrin of the Roosevelt administration, the Depression continued as well. In 1935, after a wave of legislation that was nearly unprecedented in United States history, the economic hardships that had gripped the nation were still evident. Unemployment dropped to about 20%. The Dow Jones and that industrial average, which had risen steadily from 1933 to 1934, had slowed. Approaching the halfway mark of his first term, the campaign for re-election wasn't too far off, nor was it a foregone conclusion. So much like kind of shades of the Lincoln presidency in 1963, 1964, even though they were fighting this war, it wasn't sure that he was going to be reelected. So he implemented two of the more popular policy initiatives, which were enacted in 1935. You had the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and the Social Security Act. Both appealed to working class voters and provided a boost to the 1936 election. The WPA was created after Congress passed the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act. Less than a month after Roosevelt signed the legislation into law, he established the WPA. Now, I'm not saying he did these just strictly to get reelected, but they didn't hurt. During its existence, the WPA employed over 8 million workers, with a one-year high in 1938 of 3.3 million workers employed. The work completed by the workers of the WPA changed the landscape of the nation. They were responsible for the constructions of 650,000 miles of road, 124,000 bridges, and 125,000 schools and hospitals and post offices. In addition to everyday...
Half of all those bridges can be seen in Pittsburgh.
In addition to such everyday structures like bridges, schools, and post office, the WPA built the Midway Airport in Chicago, the LaGuardia Airport in New York, the Riverwalk in San Antonio, and the Oregon State Library in Salem, Oregon, just to name a few. The blending of Art Deco...
LaGuardia sucks.
Yes, it does. The blending of Art Deco, modernism, and a worker-class aesthetic, they made WPA projects stand out in American architecture. By the time the WPA was dissolved in 1943, it had left an indelible mark upon the country. The other key legislation was the Social Security Act. The Depression was difficult for everybody, but it's more difficult for senior citizens because retirement wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing you worked towards when in this time. You are basically, you got pregnant at 13 and you worked for the rest of your life until you died. Because very few working class people could afford retirement. A person, again, worked until they were physically unable and then hoped that their family was in a position to help them. In order to provide relief to older workers and make the prospect of retiring a little less remote, again, FDR proposed the Social Security Act of 1935. This plan called for employers to have part of their wages withheld by the federal government as a method of saving for the future. Employers were required to match the employee contributions. When a person reached the age of 65, they could receive the money that had been saved for them through the Social Security program. Ida Mae Fuller was the first recipient of a Social Security payment in 1940, 1 month after she retired as a legal secretary. Though it provided a much-needed benefit to many workers, the new program did not cover certain occupations. Farmers, including sharecroppers, domestic workers, and the self-employed, were not able to participate in the program. These provisions disappropriately hurt African Americans who made up the majority of the sharecroppers and domestics in the South. Even so, the Social Security is perhaps the most enduring program to come out of Roosevelt's first term.
So Social Security, this is what bugs me, because I've grown up my whole life with people telling me there's going to be no Social Security, when it's time for me to retire, and they're always talking about it being depleted. So what the hell happened if we pay into it? How is there going to be money?
Right. And good news,
I don't understand that.
I just found out that Carter has been prescribed testosterone gel.
Congrats, Carter.
Yeah, that's good news. So this, so many of the people who voted for Roosevelt in 1932 returned, but there is also a coalition of voters. This coalition is sometimes referred to as the New Deal Coalition. It was made up of Democratic voters in the South, African Americans, women, and union members. Those who didn't fall into these categories were inspired to vote for Roosevelt because of the prevailing attitude was that he and the Democratic Party were making real progress towards recovery. All of these factors contributed to being too much for the Republican nominee, Alf Landon, who was the governor of Kansas. Yes, the election in 1932 was a large win, but in 1936, it was a landslide. It was the largest percentage of the popular vote won by a presidential candidate in history, gaining 60.8% of the vote compared to Landon's 36.5%. In the electoral college, it was even more lopsided. FDR gained 98%, or 523 electoral college votes of the possible 531. It wasn't just Roosevelt celebrating the win either. The Democrats won an additional 12 seats in the Senate and another 9 seats in the House. The majorities Democrats enjoyed at the 1932 elections were made even stronger in 1936. From a Democratic perspective, happy days were indeed here again.
Wow, that's incredible. You know what? Just to be fair, though, I'm never in my life, and I'll stand on this, voting for someone named Alf.
Man, yeah. Almost a third of all workers were unemployed. In the early years of the Depression, very little relief was available. And as the New Deal emerged, it wasn't a solution for all workers. Many still remained unemployed, and many of those employed by programs only had temporary positions. After a particular job was finished, uncertainty returned. This almost constant stress took a toll on many Americans. Not being able to work caused feelings of anxiety, resentfulness, and humiliation. And after the crash in 1929, suicides in the United States rose by 30%.
Oh, that's rough.
People were in a desperate condition and were looking for ways to cope. So as Roosevelt and the Democrats gained the power, they promoted policies friendly to organized labor. This was a stark contrast to the policies of the previous administrations dating back to the turn of the 20th century. By making collective bargaining legal, and made it safe to join unions. Membership in labor organizations rapidly increased in the 1930s. So generating this rise in union memberships was a change in philosophy by many union organizers, led by John L. Lewis. The United Mine Workers of America encouraged the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, to support industrial unionism. As opposed to only being for skilled workers, industrial unionism organized workers based on the industry they were a part of. For instance, the United States Steel Workers, United Rubber Workers, and the United States Auto Workers. At first, it was...
I just had a conversation yesterday with my brother-in-law, and he was asking me what the Boilermakers were, and I told him they were a union of some sort. But just to put it out there, I have no fucking clue what you guys do. One time, I was told by this fat dude he was a Boilermaker and how much money he made, and I was like, oh, maybe I could get into that. And he laughed at me and said, haha, you'd need to lose a few pounds there, big fella. And he was fatter than me. So just putting it out there to fuck that guy.
Fuck that guy. So all this created the AFL in 1937. They changed their name to the Congress of Industrial Organization, or the CIO. So the United Auto Workers, or the UAW, saw the most significant gains in unionization, gaining admission to the General Motors, the largest corporation in the world at the time, and Chrysler. But it did not come easy, because Henry Ford is historically known as being anti-union. Thousands were arrested in Detroit and Flint, Michigan, and thousands more injured as police and private security assaulted the striking workers. A battle outside of the Ford Motor Factory in Dearborn, Michigan in 1937 is remembered as the Battle of the Overpass. The violence that union organizers faced in an era that was friendlier towards organized labor. Pictures from the event were widely circulated in the nation, causing Ford to lose a great deal of its public image. Images like this.
Oh, boy.
And like this. Just fighting and, clashing. So it kind of...
Now, was Henry Ford an anti-Semite?
That's still up for debate, but I will tell you he was friends with Hitler.
Oh, friends with Hitler.
Oh,
that's
yeah.
a hell of a lot different than being a sympathizer.
They talked. Political organizations...
Monführer, what do you...
Political organizations also grew during the decade, especially the Communist Party. There is a debate about how many members the party gained in the 1930s, but its influence was significant. A number of leading writers, intellectuals, and artists were either sympathetic to the Communist Party or they became members. Ordinary workers did not necessarily flock to the communist banner, but they were collectively more accepting of their policies than they had been prior to the Great Depression. The Communist Party played a significant role in organized labor organizations and in being some of the first Americans to recognize the rise of fascism in Europe. So definitely a very different climate in terms of accepting the Communist Party than we saw, during the Red Scare following World War II. Because again, at this time, we didn't associate communism with evil.
I watched a clip about FDR, and there was this young kid. He couldn't have been older than 22, just going in about how FDR was a ruthless communist and destroyed the country and all that other stuff.
Yeah. And the heightened political atmosphere of the era, along with a more active government than previous eras, was reflected in much of the art produced in the Depression. It was an era that celebrated the common man. Norman Rockwell captured scenes that many of the middle-class readers of the Saturday Evening Post could relate to. The cover, entitled Springtime from 1935, looked like a country boy of modest means, yet still carrying books. You're probably like, who the fuck's Norman Rockwell? Right, Johnny?
Well, I know who that is. Nope, I know who that is.
Oh, do you?
He did a lot of the paintings that were on like Reader's Digest and whatnot.
Yes, like this one that I just popped up. This is kind of, Norman Rockwell and what he did. So during this time, as we had mentioned, a lot of Americans lost hope. So as we're going to talk about here, a lot of media, a lot of Hollywood, they kind of rallied to this to give Americans something to, watch, something to do.
Okay.
So, like I said, Hollywood, they started to make movies that kind of went to this, this climate of, the little guy winning and politics and stuff like that. And you had a lot of movie stars backing FDR, saying, hey, I believe in this man. You, the American people, need to do. You had movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The American Madness, Mr. D Goes to Town, which is just all these movies of the little guy winning.
Yeah, man. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Debbie Does Dallas, all great films of the little man winning.
So comic strips came into mass distribution in the later part of the 19th century. And you can hear more about that in episode 5, in which we discuss the king of comics, Jack Kirby.
Shout out to Jack.
Yeah, because he's listening right now. No, seriously, Jack.
He's
Kirby
listening up in heaven.
It was a great episode. It's a little longer, but if you love comics, I definitely recommend taking a look at it. So comic books, as we think of them today, became quite popular in the 1930s, with famous funnies debuting in 1934. Especially significant to modern culture was the creation of the superhero comic. Superheroes were created as like a necessity to take the American public's mind off of what was going on. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and it debuted in 1938. Though geared more towards children and adolescents, even in its earlier forms, was also geared, it also appeared to adult readers as well. Again, FDR used radio effectively throughout his presidency, and the radio was also provided entertainment straight to people's homes. And by the end of the decade, all Major League Baseball teams were broadcasting their games. Variety programs were popular, mixing comedy and music, and the broadcast of plays were common. In the 1930s, there was an explosion of serial dramas or even soap operas that dominated the airwaves.
Yeah, I think a lot of those would be podcasts today.
Yeah, man. Well, like, just like you had radio shows like Detective Mysteries, Dick Tracy, like this community kind of came together to give Americans something to look forward to. People would crowd around the radios at this time just to hear what was happening this week. It took their mind off the horribleness that was being American during this time period.
Yeah, Trump, but FDR used the radio like Trump uses Twitter. He just rode the wave of what was next, and he was going viral through your radio waves.
Right. And we can't discuss culture in the 1930s without mentioning the Federal Project #1. This initiative had 4 main areas dedicated to art, theater, writing, and music, and all under separate means. The Federal Art Project supported the work of such visual artists as Jackson Pollock, Diego Rivera, Mark Rothko, and hundreds of others. The Federal Theater Project had a similar reach and influence. Important figures in American theater were supported by the project, including Orson Welles, Arthur Miller, and John Houseman. The theater branch of the Arts Initiative produced over 40 productions between 1935 and 1938. It also provided support for theater in the African American community. The most famous and controversial at the time production was the all-African American cast of Macbeth. It is often referred to as Voodoo Macbeth because of its Caribbean setting. Performed in Harlem and directed by Orson Welles, the play was a commercial, artistic, and social success. Of all the components of Federal Project #1, the Federal Writers Project was the most prolific. Much like the Federal Theater Project, it had a profound influence on the African American writing community, aiding in the careers of Richard Wright, Margaret Walker, and Arna Bontemps. Many noteworthy authors worked on the project's American life histories and American guides, amongst other projects. Nelson Algren, Ralph Ellison, Sal Bellow, and many others contributed to the work of the Writers' Project. One of the most famous piece of works to come out of this project was called the Slave Narratives. And it was under the direction of John Lomax. Federal staffers went throughout the South and recorded 2,900 recollections of former slaves collected between 1936 and 1938. The work comprised of 17 volumes of work housed in the Library of Congress. These records provide one of the most important sources on the United States before the Civil War and on slave experience.
Wow, I'm surprised I haven't heard of that before. That sounds really interesting.
Right. So we're starting to gain traction in America. Not only is the New Deal programs implementing helping Americans, but we also have the media helping the Americans as well. And this is where we're going to end part 2. I hope it wasn't too much information for you, Johnny. I hope it was still fun to learn.
No, I had a good time. A lot of info in here, but it was all interesting stuff.
Yeah, man, that's great. I hope everybody else enjoyed. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for coming along. And I'm Dan Brady.
I'm Johnny Smith.
And as Johnny likes to say, peace and love, everybody.